The webinar is now started.
Together. Just give it another minute or so to let the rest of the attendees show up, and we'll get started. All right, looks like we've got as many folks who are waiting in, and we'll get started. People might be still trickle in here, one or two. Hello, welcome, and thank you for coming to today's event. My name is Jeff Kubiak. I'm a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies and at the Center on the Future of War. I also co-direct the center's online Masters in Global Security, and so if you're interested in that, please look it up. This is part of the Center on the Future of War Spring Speaker Series. This event is actually co-sponsored with the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at ASU. The Center on the Future of War, if for those who are not familiar, is a presidential initiative, innovative idea that connects a public research university, a large one like ASU, with a policy forward think tank in DC called New America. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Khameer Kidia. He is an ASU Future Security Fellow at ASU and New America, and I'll do a more thorough bio of him in a moment. I just want to go over the kind of rules of the road for today. Obviously, this is a Zoom webinar, so the interaction between faculty between attendees and the panel is going to be through the question and answer block. I think Khameer is going to hopefully engage you in conversation, at least at some level, through my voice as we go forward. So. Please feel free at any point in time with a question as you move forward to use a question and answer block, and I will moderate that. So Khameer Kidia is, like as mentioned, the ASU Future Security Fellow at New America and ASU. He is a writer, anthropologist, and global health physician on the faculty at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at Harvard Medical School. He's a Rhodes Scholar from Zimbabwe, and in fact is right now presently sitting in Zimbabwe. Dr. Kidia has worked on mental health research and advocacy in his home country for the last decade. His research and writing on medicine and global health have been published in outlets such as the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet Psychiatry, Slate, the Yale Review, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's working on a book now called Empire of Madness, which explores the colonial origins of the global mental health for Crown, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. Today's event is Trauma and Empire, Uprooting Psychiatry from its Colonial Origins. Dr. Kidia will talk for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A. I'll moderate Q&A through the Q&A block after that. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Khameer Kidia. Thank you, Khameer, for showing up.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you all for being here today. What a wonderful, gracious introduction. And it's just so nice to be able to share things early on in the process and get a sense of what you all think. And as I was putting this talk together, I began to realize that it's actually really hard to give a lecture on such a complex and nuanced topic, and that, the best insights for something complicated like this come from discussion. So today, I'd like to keep the lecture portion of this as abbreviated as possible and save plenty of room for questions and for discussion. I'd love it to be, as conversational as we can possibly make it on Zoom and in this format. And I know that's a challenge, but bear with me and ask as many questions as you can, because I think that's where we're really going to get to the heart of the matter. That said, today in this talk, I want to cover the basic history of trauma and help us understand trauma from a constructionist perspective. and in the process, recognize violence as a key theme that links war, colonialism, and psychiatry. And in that vein, I'd also like to give a content warning right now for violence, mental illness, and obviously for trauma throughout the talk. I'm a fourth-generation Indian Zimbabwean. When my father finished high school in the 1970s, he was drafted into the Rhodesian army to fight for the white people of Rhodesia. In the army, he was made to sleep in separate barracks with other non-white soldiers, where he received lower quality food than white soldiers did. Out in the field, he was given less ammunition, worse weaponry, and less protective gear. One day, he was sitting on the back of an open-air truck with two friends from his regiment on either side, all three of them holding rifles, similar to the one he's holding in this photograph right here. Suddenly, out of nowhere, both of his friends had their brains blown out. My dad survived and told me the story maybe twice at most during his life. And I still find it disconcerting that the state, which at the time was barely legitimate because Rhodesia had declared itself independent from Britain, was able to make my father kill his own people in order to survive. This monopoly of a sovereign state over violence, to make live or let die, as Foucault calls it, is the exact power imbalance that defines war and violence, and which I argue leads to poor psychological well-being. Although he eventually escaped as a refugee to London after a couple of years, I only ever knew my dad as a man who fought in a war, something that hugely shaped his identity. He was a good man, but he was definitely a man. A man of the war. His self-image was wrapped up in a hyper-masculine outlook. He wanted me to be good at rugby so desperately. He called homosexual men like me fudge packers and faggots. It's hard for me to tell if my dad suffered from the trauma of the war. He clearly experienced, felt, saw trauma. And he told me stories of how, when he was on rest and recuperation, he struggled to sleep. But I'm not sure I'd say my father suffered from PTSD in the sense that we know it today. And if he did, I think he disguised it pretty well. He learned to cope in the army with alcohol. Booze numbed his senses and naturalized all of the violence, and became a vice for him for the rest of his life. But other than the alcohol, I often wonder what made him resilient to the violence and trauma that he saw. And that's because even before World War I, in the American Civil War, in the Spanish-American War, the Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, physicians reported a lot of distress among soldiers. In general, by this stage, soldiers were living long after battle, thanks to advances in modern medicine. And even if they didn't have physical ailments, they displayed a wide range of psychological disturbances that doctors had begun to call war neuroses, a term that was coined by a German physician named Honigmann in 1907. But especially after this, in World War I, there were large numbers of soldiers who suffered emotional distress. But because they didn't fully know how to express it, they did so physically. They became catatonic, which is when people become withdrawn and unable to participate in conversation, stuck almost like a wax statue. They became suddenly blind, deaf, mute, or unable to walk, taste, or smell. They became paralyzed. They had muscle contractions. They suffered from fatigue, insomnia, dizziness. Here's a quote from a German psychiatrist in World War II. He wrote, "The big artillery battles of December 1914 filled the hospitals with a large number of unscathed soldiers and officers presenting with mental disturbances. From then on, that number grew at a constantly increasing rate. At first, these soldiers were hospitalized with others, but soon we had to open special psychiatric hospitals for them. Now, psychiatric patients make up by far the largest category in our armed forces. The main causes are the fright and anxiety brought about by the explosion of enemy shells and mines, and seeing maimed or dead comrades. The resulting symptoms are states of sudden muteness, deafness, general tremor, inability to stand or walk, episodes of loss of consciousness, and convulsions. At first, psychiatrists thought this was hysteria, but that was a feminine disorder, something very stigmatizing for men. And so doctors didn't really know what to do with all of these symptoms. They thought perhaps they were from nostalgia from being far away from home, or from irritable or exhausted hearts. They wondered if it was neurasthenia, a type of nervous weakness. What became clear, though, was that these symptoms really challenged hypermasculine ideas of what it meant to be a soldier, representing the power, the might of Western countries at war. And soon, these symptoms became known collectively as shell shock. And that was in part due to the work of a British physician and anthropologist called Charles Meyer, who looked at soldiers after the Battle of Loos in France in 1915. He published in a study in the Lancet a demonstration that 60 to 80% of soldiers had symptoms of neurasthenia or nervous weakness. European doctors quickly caught on after this. By the summer of the same year, 112,000 German soldiers had been diagnosed with shell shock. And by May of 1917, 15% of British soldiers had already been discharged from it. Women were also exposed to high degrees of violence as nurses and ambulance drivers, and they had the same symptoms of shell shock that men did, but they were diagnosed with hysteria instead. Many soldiers who'd also been nowhere near combat also suffered. These soldiers unconsciously developed the same symptoms as those who were getting positive attention and care, and it became hard to distinguish between shell shock and what British doctors had begun to call LMF, lack of moral fiber. By the end of World War I, back in America, the US Bureau of Census created what they called the Standard, which was used to diagnose psychological weakness among soldiers, to select out those deemed too feeble to partake in the war. In 1943, a military psychiatrist, General William Menninger, headed up a committee to revise the standard and create a formalized document that was used to identify weak soldiers before they even went out to war. They called this Medical 203, which was a technical bulletin under the War Department. Medical 203 was really important for military strength. They didn't want weak men in the military because this would make the state vulnerable. But what happened with Medical 203 is it began to be used by psychiatrists who returned from military duty after World War II in their general practices. And in 1952, it formed the basis for the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which was created by the American Psychiatric Association. The DSM is today in its 5th edition and is the gold standard for the diagnosis of psychiatric conditions in North America and really in most of the world. But its historical basis was as a manual for figuring out whether or not men were psychologically fit for war. Interestingly, by World War II, though, shell shock seemed to fall out of favor. You know, the DSM was out there, or at least Medical 203 was out there, and these symptoms began to be linked with cowardice. They were thought of as people who were trying to evade the manly duty of going to war. And suddenly, the symptoms became much rarer. The loss of speech, catatonia, inability to walk, all of those things that had been seen in World War I became a lot more rare. The story of any sickness, writes anthropologist Roy Grinker, is one that doctors and patients weave together, in which they find consensus about what constitutes a culturally legitimate and sensible symptom at a particular moment in history. And it was only in the Vietnam War that PTSD as we know it today became a more official category. in the 1960s and 70s, there was a strong anti-war movement that were calling for some kind of official recognition of the harms of war. And so when soldiers came back with flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, PTSD became a diagnosis that could be used to blame the war, to call it into question. And it was a diagnosis that was contingent on having experienced something terrible, one of the only psychiatric conditions to do so. All other psychiatric conditions are essentially descriptions of a constellation of symptoms, whereas a requirement of PTSD is that a particular traumatic event must have happened in the life of the patient. These are the DSM criteria for PTSD. I think I might have cut off the top, but I wondered whether it would be worth going through them, and I thought about it a lot and really feel like it's worth us discussing these criteria because they tell you a little bit about the state of PTSD in medical practice today. So there's a bunch of criteria, and in criterion A, you need one of these things. The person needs to have been exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following ways. So directly, by seeing it, by just hearing from a friend or a relative that was exposed to the trauma that they've been exposed to it, or indirectly in the course of first responders, medics, nurses, doctors who are working on the front line. So you need one of those types of exposures. Then in criterion B, you need one of the following. So the traumatic event needs to be re-experienced over and over again, either in upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, or emotional distress after exposure to a reminder, a physical reactivity after exposure to a reminder. So you need one of those. Then in criterion C, you need avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the trauma in the following ways. One of them, trauma-related thoughts or feelings or trauma-related reminders. In criterion D, you need negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways. Inability to recall key features of the trauma, overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world, exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma, negative affect, decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing positive affect, and you need two of those. In criterion E, trauma-related arousal and reactivity that began or worsened after the trauma, you need two of the following: irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startled reaction, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. Criterion F, all of these symptoms need to have lasted for more than 1 month. Criterion G, symptoms need to create a distress or functional impairment. So they need to actually affect your life in some way, make it difficult to live. And finally, in criterion H, we have to make sure that none of these things are due to drugs or to some other chronic illness, some neurological problem. So, these are the criteria of PTSD. And I say them out loud here, so each time a psychiatrist diagnoses someone with PTSD, what they're going through. This is this laundry list of things that make it sound, very official and like well thought out and put together. But really, there's not a whole lot of evidence for the way that these symptoms are clustered together. So what PTSD ended up doing and accomplishing for Vietnam War vets was that it legitimized their status as victims. It also gave them moral exculpation for their involvement in violence. And finally, it guaranteed them a disability pension. In their incredible ethnographic work, which is called Trauma and Empire, two anthropologists, Didier Fassin and Richard Rechtman, advocate for a constructionist view of trauma, something that they call a politics of trauma. They write, trauma is produced through mobilizations of mental health professionals and defenders of victims' rights, and more broadly, by a restructuring of the cognitive and moral foundations of our societies that define our relationship to misfortune, memory, and subjectivity. A critical reading of trauma rejects the naturalization of the concept. So this differs from what we call an essentialist view of trauma, where trauma is seen as something organic in the human brain, or some kind of psychic issue of the unconscious that still needs to be resolved. It moves trauma away from the individual and towards a broader social perspective and understanding of trauma, something that I think is absolutely fundamental. In a fantastic book called Crazy Like Us, a journalist, his name is Ethan Waters, tells the story of how in 2004, Western traumatologists flocked to Sri Lanka after a tsunami hit Southeast Asia. These traumatologists believed that there was going to be a second wave, they called it the second wave, of psychological distress, and that the biggest problem faced by the Sri Lankans wasn't the tsunami itself, but rather the depression and the PTSD and the suicide that was going to follow. Suddenly, there was an industrial complex of trauma therapy and research, what Waters calls the largest international psychological intervention of all time. The therapists imported techniques like play therapy, yoga, meditation, and something called critical incident stress debriefing, which we'll talk about later. They meant well, these Westerners, but when Sri Lankans didn't experience trauma in the anticipated way, they had more body aches and very atypical symptoms, and sometimes no symptoms at all, the Westerners assumed that Sri Lankans were in denial. The idea, writes Waters, that people from different cultures might have fundamentally different psychological reactions to a traumatic event is hard for Americans to grasp. So now time for a little bit of a story. Early on in the pandemic, I was asked by a group of doctors in Zimbabwe if I could help run a peer support group for some of the more junior doctors who were really struggling during the pandemic. They were seeing a lot of death and they were really scared by a lot of the stuff in the media. There wasn't a vaccine yet in Zimbabwe. I tentatively agreed. It was something that I found. I wondered if I'd be able to help at all in the situation, but I came in on Zoom running these peer support groups, and I did what had just been taught to me at medical school in America. I listened. Sometimes I validated. I said things like, I can't imagine how hard that must be. Other times, I named their feelings. That sounds scary. I thanked them for their vulnerability, asked them to be non-judgmental, called for moments of silence. I held space. All these terms from psychology that have entered our pop cultural vernacular by now, what New Yorker writer Katie Waldman calls therapy speak. And the Zimbabwean doctors loved it. We had 2 years of these peer sessions every week, and they proved to be very, very fruitful for us coming together. But at one point during the pandemic, the South African variant hit Zimbabwe, and suddenly the death rate soared. The organizers asked me if there was something more that we could do to help these junior doctors since they were struggling to cope with all of the death that they were seeing. I suggested we run a trauma debriefing workshop. I set out to make it as rich and constructive as I possibly could. I started with the model that we use in our hospital in Boston: pause, prepare, analyze, understand, sentiment, educate. Sounds very nice, doesn't it? We call this critical incident stress debriefing. It was pioneered in 1983 by a paramedic and a firefighter who got a new job for himself. He became a trauma specialist, and it's an impressively simple approach. A short, structured conversation performed within 72 hours of the traumatic event. Very easy. But, drumroll, the evidence for critical incident stress debriefing is very limited. A study in the Lancet of trauma interventions showed that not only did critical incident stress debriefing not improve natural recovery from psychological trauma, but actually fared far worse than any of the other trauma interventions. I knew this, but the lack of evidence didn't stop me. I went ahead and scheduled the workshop anyways. I thought, well, if we were doing it in Boston, it had to be good for Zimbabweans as well. And so here we were on Zoom. This is just a fake little picture of a Zoom screen. And one doctor, a woman in her late 20s, shared a really tragic story of losing a colleague to suicide during the pandemic. We role-played debriefing the scenario as though we had all experienced the trauma. I had one doctor pretend to lead the debriefing, and I fed him phrases he could use to help us discuss the event. How was this for everyone? What part of this felt emotionally difficult or challenging? And suddenly, the conversation, very different to our previous Zoom support groups, became stilted. People started dropping off the Zoom. Eventually, there were only 2 people left, including the doctor whose case we were debriefing. But I was still convinced somehow that I was helping. At the end, I asked, how was this for everyone? There was complete silence. And that's when I realized I was alone. And I had been alone for quite some time. I tried one last, hello, and then I clicked end meeting for all. The workshop had failed. And when it did, something really changed for me. As I reflected on the impact of the pandemic on my well-being compared to my compatriots in Zimbabwe, I couldn't help but question a category like mass global trauma. We'd been told that a defining feature of the pandemic is that everyone, everywhere, is going through the same thing. But this felt far from what I was witnessing. The way we make meaning of events in our lives, including trauma, is determined by our context. And since I first arrived in the US for college, I'd been indoctrinated in the American social system on how to think about and live life. In his controversial essay in the British Medical Journal, South African psychiatrist Derek Summerfield takes up this social constructionist view of trauma. He writes, in Western societies, the conflation of distress with trauma increasingly has a naturalistic feel. It has become part of everyday descriptions of life's vicissitudes. Summerfield believed that Western psychiatry is trying to convert human misery and pain into technical problems that can be fixed. His warning helps explain a tension that I have felt between my mental health work in Zimbabwe and my life in America. What many of my Boston friends called trauma during COVID, not seeing their family, fear of contamination, rising death tolls, even just reading the New York Times was traumatic, didn't seem to concern Zimbabweans. None of these problems were an issue in our weekly Zoom meetings. And when I brought up this idea of trauma, a young Zimbabwean doctor said, in Zimbabwe, it's never-ending cycles of trauma. And what she meant was that Zimbabweans have lived through constant life-threatening hardship, colonialism, civil war, political violence, drought, cyclones, poverty, disease, and famine. In a country where 40% of the population lives in extreme poverty, and life expectancy in the mid-2000s was down to 45 years. COVID, this thing that came along, just added a little fuel to a slow-burning trauma dumpster fire. And the same really could be said of minoritized populations in America. Women and queer people have faced worsening domestic violence during the pandemic. Black and Latinx communities have suffered the effects of white supremacy and structural inequity. But since these communities perpetually experience such hardship, they can't point to where trauma begins and where it ends. They don't have the luxury of reflecting on their circumstances and voicing their grievances through the lens of trauma. Calling trauma by that name is a privilege afforded really to a select few. And this doesn't mean that people are immune to trauma. It means people construct meaning out of traumatic events and express trauma in diverse ways. In Zimbabwe, most people haven't heard of PTSD or trauma. Those who have experienced severe traumatic events like abuse tend to use the Shona expression, kufungisisa, or thinking too much. By itself, thinking too much is less a discrete psychiatric disorder like depression or PTSD, though it is in the DSM. Instead, it's a way of expressing mental anguish, what medical anthropologists call an idiom of distress. Thinking too much also exists in lots of other non-Western cultures. Kut Karin among Cambodian refugees who've experienced trauma, and Amomna Ipal in post-conflict Uganda. When people think too much, their minds become hazy with issues like financial hardship, interpersonal relationships, and spiritual concerns, sometimes to the point where it becomes difficult to function. But anthropological research shows that, for the most part, people living under conditions of poverty or violence are less concerned with the traumatic event itself. Instead, they ruminate about material issues like money and food. And so what becomes clear is that even if trauma exists outside the United States and Europe, the response to trauma doesn't necessarily take on the shape or form that American psychiatrists expect. So I'm talking to you all at the Center for the Future of War. You're all international relations and global policy experts. And as I've tried to figure out for this audience, what links trauma, war, colonialism, psychiatry, one thing keeps resurfacing: violence. And I want to be explicit here. Empire is an inherently violent conquest. To take charge of a people, to force them into submission, extract their labor, use their natural resources, that's a type of violence that begets war. And when you start that type of violence, the only way out is violence itself. It's a vicious cycle. Even the process of decolonization to escape colonialism is inherently violent. Nation states allowed for self-determination and sovereignty in the post-colonies. But the problem of the nation state is that it almost requires violence to create an imagined community of people. This often led to violent conflict among ethnic and religious groups, and even ethnic cleansing in the name of nationalism. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's regime committed a massive genocide, killing thousands of people from the minority Ndebele tribe soon after independence. But there's another type of violence that connects colonialism and psychiatry, what Gayatri Spivak has called epistemic violence in her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? When we rob the marginalized of their voice, when we destroy their knowledge systems, their language, their beliefs, their culture, and replace it with colonial categories, that constitutes violence. When we tell someone suffering from the violence of war, from oppression and poverty that are created by colonialism and capitalism, that they have depression or PTSD or anxiety, what we do is we make the problem their own individual problem and take the blame away from a larger system of violence. I realized that when I gave that trauma debriefing workshop, that this was exactly what I was doing. I was telling people who were suffering that they were individually weak, even though the violence that produced their condition was a product of vaccine apartheid and global inequality, what my mentor Paul Farmer called structural violence. I couldn't help but call it trauma, even though for these Zimbabweans, they didn't get anything out of this naming. They didn't get positive reinforcement or care or disability pensions, just a Western name for the horror that they had experienced. And this naming, in and of itself, is a type of silencing, a type of violence. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's really powerful. Dr. Kidia, that's really nice talk. We've got one question in the question and answer block from Anne. Isn't there a danger in re-traumatizing the subjects by debriefing, and how might that be avoided in a situation where you found yourself in your session where everybody, where you kind of make an individual trauma as opposed to sort of societal or structural trauma? are we doing more damage then in the situation where we're trying to debrief it, or are we doing some good there?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And, it calls into question a lot of really important stuff about these interventions that have been out there and that we kind of willy-nilly spread across the globe without giving second thought to what we're doing. And I think, of course, there is a huge risk of re-traumatizing people. And, at the time I was naive. I wanted to help people. And I thought to myself, well, we do this in Boston. It's called critical incident stress debriefing. It must work. There's this, this guy, Jeffrey Mitchell, he's got this whole system. And I didn't think twice about whether or not the stuff that I'd been taught at my hospital in Boston applied to people elsewhere, or if it even worked at all. And that's why I bring up the evidence from the Lancet, right? The study that looked at trauma interventions in 2002 actually showed that this doesn't help at all. And so, not only does it not help, as this participant, has brought up, it can actually make things worse for people. And I think we get stuck in Western thought around psychology and psychiatry in terms of what helps. And, the Western ideal is very individualized. In Western psychiatry, we're taught to turn inwards, go internal, figure out what happened in your childhood, or kind of process everything that you've been through. And that idea of having to process, from Freud and from other theorists in the psychoanalytic discipline, that idea comes from what they call fragmented memories and trying to put them back together and repiece the whole traumatic memory, make it whole before it's too late. People always say, we mustn't, let this go on too long. You have to process these memories. But there's no real evidence for that. That's something that is, prevalent in Western thought and thinking, but it may not apply in elsewhere in the world, and it may not even apply in America as we look at the evidence for trauma interventions.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I was a flying safety officer for a Air Force flying wing in 2000. Right about then, and actually got trained in critical incident stress management as a result, because I would be involved in responding to accidents, to aircraft accidents that could be fairly traumatic. So I was going to be one of the incidents like that. It was kind of a crazy time. I don't think the Air Force is doing that anymore, but that was a very interesting part of it, because the evidence just didn't exist that it was going to do that is doing anything. Real good question from one of the attendees here says, I absolutely love what you have said about structural violence. Something that always comes up when I try and explain this to people is that they bring up that it may instill helplessness in people, telling them it's a global inequality problem, for example, something bigger than them. What can we do to empower people and avoid this feeling that things cannot change? It's a really good question.
That is a brilliant question. And this is a question that eats me alive, because before he died, my mentor, Paul Farmer, and I were in discussion about this exact issue. Paul felt it was really important to name structural violence, but his interventions in the world were actually all quite individualized. He started up clinics in Haiti, and did a type of global health that was very much on an individual level. And I always questioned this. I asked him, like, what are you doing giving individual people one medicine at a time when the problem, as you state in all of your work, is structural? And I think what I learned from this is just that this is a classic tension in all of the social sciences, this tension between structure and agency, and that we're always kind of oscillating between those two things. I think the two go hand in hand, right? I think that what structural naming does for people, by telling people that what's going on in their lives is structural, what it does is take away the blame from them. And I think when we're talking about mental distress, that's a really important thing, because, we're talking about emotions, affect, feeling. And when you feel as though you are to blame for what's going on in your mind, you feel very guilty. And those kind of negative emotions tend to accumulate. And I think having a structural reason for what's going on in here can be incredibly liberating for a lot of people. And there's all sorts of excellent writing, starting with Fanon, about liberation psychology and psychiatry, and how, just being in protest to the system is individually helpful for people who are partaking in it. That said, there is that loss of agency when you do that. It feels like you're out of control. And I think, the balance in the system is kind of returning to what I've learned from philosophies outside of Western thought, and that's collective well-being. So in a lot of African cultures, we think of well-being in a sense that is much more communal and much less individualized. And what that means is that, our well-being is intersubjective. It's something that relies on each other in a community. And when you start to think about things in that way, a reliance on each other and a tendency towards thinking about the future, what it does is give you kind of intersubjective ideas about well-being. And in that intersubjectivity, you don't fully lose agency, but you share it with people. And I think that is a really powerful kind of in-between between that kind of structural loss of kind of agency and like the individualized notions in Western psychiatry.
That's interesting. You're right. The structure agent issue is really, it's troubling, and there are ways to work through that. And I appreciate that answer. There are a lot of folks in the audience, obviously, that are very interested in this question. Is there a way can we pass along your contact information to have them reach out to you for further discussion on this topic if they choose to do so? Absolutely. Great, we'll do that. So another question coming from the audience here says, could you associate necro-citizenship to the rationalizations of individual trauma and its nation-state colonial settler and national cultural imposition? Too many words in there I did not understand. So maybe you did?
I honestly don't understand it. Maybe you want to read it one more time, but I hear some like necropolitics, Achille Mbembe in there, some kind of Mamdani theorist speak, and I think what I need is kind of a question that's just a little bit parsed away from the theory. I'm not as much critical theory as I use in the way that I work. I'm not a critical theorist. I'm a physician.
Right.
I don't know if I fully got the whole thing. So maybe just a little bit of clarification would be helpful. And
I'll let that individual add to the question in the question and answer block here in a second. So in the meantime, I'll press on to the next one. It says, do you think this continuous activation of the sympathetic nervous system with marginalized communities might be part of the reason we have such health disparities in the United States?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's fascinating. For anyone who has read The Body Keeps the Score, which I think is the book that everyone thinks about when they think about trauma. It's been a New York Times bestseller, #1 for years at this point. That is one of the kind of ideas about this biological link, and I do think that the activation of your sympathetic nervous system, cortisol levels, all of those things count. And there are studies that show differences in for example, states with same-sex marriages, where it's legalized and where it isn't, in the way that people's kind of brains and cortisol levels are different in those instances. And I think what this all kind of is trying to do is try and give us a biological reason to kind of really think about trauma in a way that is sort of essentialist. And I think it's important to keep pushing the biology of trauma as much as possible. That said, I will say that the state of biology for trauma is pretty unformed. What The Body Keeps the Score kind of doesn't do very well is put it all together in a way that makes total sense. Bessel van der Kolk is very good at kind of, weaving his narratives of his patients with little factoids from studies about trauma, fMRI studies, cortisol level studies. And I think that those two things go together very well. But I will say that the biology of trauma, as we know today, is still pretty underdeveloped. And we don't know for sure. And so while we're figuring that out, I think, trying to combine those biological views with social constructionist views is really, really important, because we can see clear links there where biological links don't always exist in all studies.
All right, good. I agree. That's great. And kind of along the same lines, actually, question from our audience here: how do we, or should we, differentiate between the conditions resulting from trauma and violence, as discussed here, related to war, and conditions in the civilian space resulting from situations like divorce or domestic violence? I ask, as using the same diagnostic PTSD may be doing those who need help a disservice. How do you feel about that?
So I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think the question is asking about hierarchies of trauma, and, is sort of saying that the trauma experienced by war, that's clear, certain, violent events, but that other types of traumas, in our daily lives may get lost. And I think this is, this goes back to what Derek Summerfield said in the British Medical Journal, that in so many ways, these, vicissitudes of daily living kind of get, umbrellaed under this idea of trauma. But I do think that domestic violence, that violence there is a defining feature of trauma. And for me, what's important about violence is the power dynamic. And I think domestic violence is like a clear-cut thing. If you go back to the PTSD definitions in the DSM, it actually does allow for most of the things that were mentioned in that question to be defined as a type of trauma. If you'll remember, even just listening to a story of someone else who's had trauma counts as exposure.
Interesting. Yeah, good. All right. Let's see. Another question from the audience here. I feel that empathy is the underlying root of violence. I am currently researching the ways in which Americans view empathy and exploring options to combat this deficit, in which I believe the education system is key. Do you think that tackling empathy in childhood, more specifically in schools, could create a shift in the American politicians' view of violence and war?
Yes. Absolutely, right? So I think in so many ways, if you've read Bell Hooks, All About Love, like, what she's writing there is to think about the answer to so much conflict as love. And I think we're lacking that. And I do believe it. I'm not sure that, in the same exact way that it is the exact antidote to trauma. But I think when you go back from a structural perspective and a social perspective, yes, could we infuse the American social system with more love and empathy and hope that that makes a difference? Absolutely. I'm an anthropologist. And in so many ways, that's what I'm calling for. What I always struggle with is, how do we affect that kind of change? And I would love to hear from this person who asked this question, what are some ways that we could change what is essentially the culture of a people to make them more empathetic or empathic? And I think that is a much, much harder thing to do. And, yes, you can start in schools, but I think it starts even, before schools. And for me, so much of it starts with the very system under which we live, which is capitalism, which really forces an individualized perspective on the world, an every man for himself perspective. And it doesn't promote, connectivity and communality and empathy and love and connection. It tells us we should go out into the world and fend for ourselves, and there will be a meritocratic process that will reward us. And I think that is, a major source of violence. And so, yes, can we increase empathy by changing our entire social order? Yes. Can we change our entire social order?
It could change for us. We could be, that'd be a catastrophic change, but that individual actually went on and asked, how do we globalize this? So even if we could do it in the schools, globalizing it actually is, I don't know, that's a function of the capitalism, which you think potentially is part of the issue in our orientation towards the other. That's a very interesting question. Another question at the bottom here, Steve.
Can I stop you for a moment on the globalization aspect? Because I think it's quite important to think a little bit about this. When you think about the way that the global economy and the world is structured, where Western superpowers in the global north, essentially in the wakes of colonialism, control the world order, hegemony. What's happening there is a dramatic power imbalance between the West and the global South. And that power imbalance is shored up in so many ways by the global economy and the global capitalist system. And I think that, if you're trying to think about how do you globalize this type of empathy, we can start with things like reparations for colonialism or forgiving multilateral debt. I know that sounds so far removed from thinking about well-being and mental health. But if you think about the ways that large financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, essentially have burdened countries in the global South that were wrecked by colonialism with debt, they've done another kind of violence that continues to perpetuate this global power dynamic. So if you think about from a global perspective, what would make people happier everywhere? What would solve poverty? Well, it's a difference between the haves and the have-nots, right? People in America waste hundreds of millions or hundreds of billions of dollars of food every year, when in my country, nearly 50% of the country lives in food insecurity. That's an injustice that doesn't have to happen. And all it is about distribution of wealth and of privilege. And so what it takes from a global perspective is actually rethinking from a large economic perspective, these relationships that have very strong power dynamics between global North and global South institutions and countries. I want to make sure that we don't stop at thinking about mental health or well-being as something defined by just one small community or just by one country. That's never going to work. It has to be something that is globally and communally fought for and agreed for.
Interesting. On the topic of empathy, one of the participants here, one of the audience members says, I would approach the empathy standpoint with caution, though, right? Need to be careful to avoid labeling people as victims, stripping them of agency. Again, we need to approach this as a structural problem, not a problem of feeling bad for others. Is that a pretty reasonable way to think through that?
Yeah, it's the same issue, right? The structure and agency issue that that is kind of at the heart of all of this. And that ethnography that I mentioned, and the Empire of Trauma, Fassan and Rechtman, that's exactly what they're looking at. They're looking at the way that the moral economy created by the invention of PTSD has created a type of victimhood. And that victimization is a really, really kind of disempowering thing to do. And that's why I keep going back to these large structural components, as much as it makes sometimes the individual feel agentical. I really do believe, like this person does, that the victimhood issue is a major problem with trauma.
Interesting. I agree. One more question here from the audience. Can you talk a bit about how you navigate the risks of naturalizing definitions and boundaries of groups when addressing or comparing cultural differences in how trauma is understood or experienced, particularly when it comes to discussion with individuals?
Can you say the question one more time?
Yeah, it's a pretty dense question. Can you talk a bit more about how you navigate the risks of naturalizing definitions and boundaries of groups when addressing or comparing cultural differences in how trauma is understood or experienced, particularly when it comes to the discussion with individuals? I wish I could unpack that for you just a little bit. Maybe the attendee can help with unpacking it just a little bit by giving us some more insight.
Yeah, so, I think what this question is getting at is, at the individual level, when we're, discussing trauma with someone, what we don't want to do is naturalize their trauma. And I really, the question is so there's so many layers to it that I'm just like, I need to like write it down. So in the first phrase,
how do you navigate the risks of naturalizing definitions and boundaries of groups when addressing or comparing cultural differences in how trauma is understood or experienced, particularly when it comes to discussions with individuals?
So I think, this is a question about cultural difference. And I think what's really critical here, and I'm just going to answer the question that I think that I'm supposed to answer. What's really critical here is thinking about things through the lens that is most socially and culturally appropriate for the person that you're kind of working with on an individual level. And there are lots of ways of doing that, but I think an important thing in this context is to go back to indigenous knowledge. So for Zimbabweans, for example, like I said, trauma is not something that actually exists. And people say, kufungisisa, I'm thinking too much, or moyo unorwadza, my heart feels burdened. And these are what we call idioms of distress. They're ways of expressing mental anguish. And what I think is really important is to work with as much indigenous knowledge as we possibly can. And if possible, have everything done by indigenous systems and really privilege those systems. So in Zimbabwe, we have what's called a pluralistic medical system, which means we have hospitals and we have clinics and Western trained doctors. There's 3 medical schools here training doctors in the same type of medicine that I learned in the States. And we also have indigenous healers, faith healers, traditional healers, spirit mediums, and they deal a lot with the problem of mental illness all of the time. And what I think is really important here is to really privilege those knowledge systems in the right context. And I'll give it a quick example. When someone comes to a traditional healer with a problem in their social life, be it a romantic problem or domestic abuse or an issue within their family or poverty, what that traditional healer does is they interpret for this person in their social and cultural context what might be a problem. And then, they if they're a spirit medium, they'll call the ancestors and they'll come up with some kind of solution to the way that the person is thinking about this problem and help them solve that problem. Not so dissimilar to what we do in Western psychiatry called cognitive behavioral therapy. And so in so many ways, what we're doing when we do cognitive behavioral therapy, right, we're helping someone with their maladaptive cognition and behaviors and prescribing ways for them to think out of that within the context of Western psychiatry. And that works for people in a Western context. So the best thing for people is to have their version of cognitive behavioral therapy from the most appropriate indigenous knowledge system. And what we need to do from a Western superpower standpoint in academia, in medicine, is to privilege those systems of knowledge as equal to CBT. Because the only reason we think of CBT as this incredible, amazing thing that is so evidence-based and works really well is because we do our funny thing called science on it, right? We do these studies and we say, look, cognitive behavioral therapy has a great evidence base. Everyone seems to improve on this wellness scale that we give them at the beginning and at the end. Well, I can tell you that if you speak to people who go to indigenous healers in their own context, they also improve about the way that they're feeling about what's going on in their mind after they've been to their indigenous healer. And so we need to be careful in our system of knowledge in the world not to underprivilege such types of knowledge and to actually elevate them. And that is to get over this idea of epistemic injustice, epistemic violence that had kind of ended on from Spivak's essay and from an excellent theorist called Miranda Fricker at CUNY.
Excellent. I like to end these events at right at an hour, just because we've taken enough of your time, I assume, and I appreciate the energy you've put into your work. One member of the audience did mention that he's very interested in the topic and is looking to see when and where he can purchase your book when it comes out. Do you have a timeline for publication yet at all?
Yeah, so the book is under contract at the moment. I think it's going to be a couple of years because it's still early in the process. But I will tweet the heck out of it when it's there, and follow me on social media, and I will make sure that once it's out there that it's accessible to as many people as it needs to be.
Fantastic. There are a couple of questions left in the question and answer block. I'll leave this open and see if we can get to them at some point in time after the fact. So I appreciate the audience's engagement. It was very good engagement by the audience and the questions. And Dr. Kidia, it was fantastic. Great talk, really interesting stuff. We appreciate you taking the time and doing this. And I would like to, just, as I said, pass along our thanks from the Center on the Future of War at ASU and wish you all the best in your work going forward.
Thanks so much. Pleasure's all mine.
All right, thank you. And that should end our event for today. We have lots of events coming up, so we hope that you can join us in future events. Thank you all for coming today.